Hello again, I am Blunty, and this is the OUYA, which is an Android-based gaming console system that's just about to launch. In fact, by the time this video goes live, it should be hitting retail shelves in Canada and in the UK and in the US of A, but not here in Australia. The reason I've got one here in Australia is because I was a Kickstarter backer. I am responsible for this thing existing through the Kickstarter project. So I'm going to review it. And I'm going to review it in three parts. This is the first part where I'll be looking at the hardware and the controller and stuff like that and see how all that feels, because it's very, very important. In the second part, we're going to be looking at the native system and the native games and the operating system and the interface and the shop and all that sort of stuff. And in the third part, we're going to look at my favorite part, which is the gaming emulation side of things, emulating classic arcade games and home system consoles from the NES and the Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis, you Yanks call them, and, you know, the whole schmeal. But today we're looking at the hardware, so let's get to it. As you can see here, and perhaps saw in my one-man Three Stooges impersonation that passed as my unboxing video, there's not much to it. A little box roughly the same size as a Rubik's Cube, and a controller whose design is, if we're being generous, inspired by the Xbox 360's controller, and if we're being pessimistic, quite obviously stolen near inch for inch, perhaps by a designer who has had the 360's controller described to them over the phone, but has never actually held one themselves. The box itself is a rather pleasant, understated and relatively elegant design. A single lit-up button on top for powering on and off, and some ports around the back. Although being so small and light, you may have to fiddle with your cords a bit, as using a particularly heavy or stiff HDMI cord, for instance, can kind of drag the box around or lift it up just a little bit. Now, ports-wise, you've got power up top, a simple standard 12-volt power input, an Ethernet port, although there is, of course, Wi-Fi built into it too, a micro USB port right next to that, and this is only for connecting it directly to a PC, because every OUYA console is also an OUYA dev kit console that can be used to develop games for the system also. Then there's a standard HDMI port and a single USB port for attaching things like memory sticks for expanding your storage, and other accessories like wired gamepads or keyboards and mice and the like. Now, the guts of this game console is a NVIDIA Tegra 3 based Android device. Not the most powerful chipset currently available for Android devices, by the way, but because it's not a battery powered phone or tablet, the hardware can be used to its full power potential without having to cripple things down for the sake of getting decent battery life or limiting the temperature in a device that has no fans or proper cooling vents like a phone or tablet. So here, in the OUYA, all four cores of that CPU can be belted right up to max power, as can the GeForce ULP graphics chipset. There's even a quiet little fan inside to help keep temperatures under control when things are completely maxed out. Now, all this means it still should handily outperform similarly spec'd Tegra 3 based tablets and the like. And if you are more of the hacky persuasion, it's going to be easier to overclock and tweak around as well. There's a gig of DDR3 SD-RAM in there, and 8 gigs of flash storage memory, which is a little bit on the small side these days, it has to be said, but more on that in a moment. There's 802.11bgn Wi-Fi, which was a little flaky for me when I first booted up, but a system update seems to have cured that completely, and now things have been rock solid. Bluetooth LE 4.0 is on board, which is nice, and it's currently running Android 4.1, otherwise known as Jelly Bean, with a custom OUYA designed launcher, which has been specifically designed for that 10-foot TV experience and gamepad control. And of course, being Android-based also means, of course, you can run alternative launchers if you like, but we'll get into that in part 2, where we talk more about the software and the games. Now, onto that controller, arguably the most important part of a game system's hardware. It's a relatively comfortable controller, it fits well on the hand and balances nicely, it's light enough to be easy to use for long periods, and hefty enough to feel substantial and not too flimsy. It is lighter than the 360's control pad, but heavier than the PS3's. The plastic does feel a bit cheap though, particularly the silver panels, which actually snap on magnetically and under which lies a compartment for a AA battery on each side. Now it is a bit fiddly to get these on and off without feeling uncontrollably clumsy about it all, but the good news is battery life seems to be pretty decent, so at least you won't have to do it like every day or something. Now using AA batteries is a good thing in my mind. They're easy and cheap to get in either the disposable variety or, more usefully and less environmentally desecratingly, some rechargeables. The twin thumbsticks have about the same resistance as the 360s, but have slightly more travel and are convex like the PS3s. They're a bit on the slippy side for my tastes, but that hasn't been a huge problem while playing, it has to be said. The dead zone is also just a bit bigger than you're perhaps used to. But the control is still quite fine and works well enough so long as the game is properly written for analog sticks, and at this early stage that can still be a bit of a problem. The sticks also click in for an additional action button, as all good thumbsticks should these days. The D-pad has some rather hard edges on the cross-section, and the disc-like design is spongy and mushy, much like the universally loathed original 360s D-pad. But not quite as bad, if I'm honest. It is a bit more responsive than the 360s and works okay for most D-pad intensive games like, say, Street Fighter type fighters and old school arcade games and the like. But those hard edges can get a bit uncomfortable for particularly long play sessions. The good news is, for those of you who do find it just too mushy and off-putting, or the hard edges sort of slice into your thumbs, you will be happy to know that the OUYA will work perfectly with a standard PS3 controller instead. The action buttons stand well proud of the surface and have a very positive, if noisy, clicky feel. They're far better than the mushy buttons on the PS3 and even more positively resistive and clicky than the 360s. They're spaced well and are very responsive. The shoulder and trigger buttons aren't quite as nice though. These are perhaps the cheapest feeling components of the controller. The triggers on both of my controllers tend to squeak just a little bit, and the shoulder buttons are placed just slightly too high and proud to feel entirely natural as they should. That said, they do work fine, and aside from the ergonomics of it, which maybe I'll get used to, maybe I won't, I've had no real issues with them in-game. The unmarked dark expanse in the center top portion of the controller is actually a trackpad. Well, kind of. Truthfully, it's one of the worst trackpads I have ever tried to use. It's clumsy, often unresponsive, especially to action taps. Its sensitive area is completely unmarked, so you never really know where the functional edge is until you're past it. And if you're looking for accurate or fine control over the mouse pointer on screen, forget it. It's a bloody nightmare to use, I'm telling you right now. On one occasion, it was so catastrophically clumsy and infuriating, I actually had to resort to plugging in a PC's USB mouse into it just so I could get shit done. Now, I hope this is just some crappy code sitting in Android, and the hardware is otherwise sound, and this can be fixed in a software update. But right now, as it stands, I dread and furiously resent whenever I have to use it. Which you will have to occasionally do, by the way, whether you like it or not, as some of the native games, or supposedly native games, are in fact very lazy ports of games whose menu systems in particular are still based on touchscreen interfaces and haven't been updated properly for gamepad control. Now, aside from that, there's a single system button which sits flush against the surface at the bottom middle edge. This is for bringing up system menus, and a double tap will bring up the main system launcher. And a set of 4 rather dim LEDs line the top edge, indicating connection status and player number, much like the ring on the 360's controller works. Overall, it's a decent but not great controller. The good news is that, aside from what I already mentioned of the PS3's controller being pretty much natively supported, you can also use many USB wired controllers and even the 360's wireless controller if you have the USB wireless adapter that Microsoft sell for using it on PCs. And being built on the open Android system, I'm sure there will be plenty of other options for Bluetooth gaming controllers that can be supported also. So even if you hate the native controller, that doesn't necessarily have to be a deal breaker on this system. So, my takeaway message on the hardware side of things for the OUYA. Well, it's pretty nice, especially so for something that slides in at under $100. The 8GB of onboard flash storage is a bit on the small side, and within a day I did find myself digging through my gear drawer for a spare 8GB USB thumbstick to double it up. But then again, I did have a load of ROMs and disk images, and I'd been testing a whole bunch of emulators and many games, so I was using up quite a lot of space. But more on that side of things in part 3 when we start talking about emulators. Point is, there's not a lot of system memory, but it's easy to expand. Now, the gamepad also isn't as bad as some of the earliest reviewers said it was. That's partially because most of those earliest reviews were irresponsibly published within an hour or so of their kits arriving at their doors before any serious testing was even attempted, and I doubt they even played a single friggin' game on them, because some blogs are run and written by hacks and whores who don't actually care about making useful or accurate content, but only really care about being first, so they get the most page hits and a big SEO bang. And it's partly because the very earliest units from the first manufacturing batch out of the OUYA factory were a bit crappy. But based on feedback of those earliest units, some of the manufacturing molds were retooled to make the controllers fit and finish meet a higher standard, and a few firmware updates later to fix some of the initial issues with lagginess and other things like that, and things got better really fast. And now that I've spent a few pretty solid days doing little else but screwing around with my OUYA and playing a bunch of different game types and a big pile of old school emulators, and I can say the OUYA is a decent bit of hardware with a decent controller. Nothing about it is going to blow your socks off at this stage, but that's not what the OUYA is really about. And for the asking price, I feel very confident in calling it pretty damn good value. So that's it for the hardware. Join me in the next video where I'll break down the user interface, the native gaming platform, the shop, the games of course, and side-loading other Android games and software not being natively supplied in the OUYA ecosystem. Spoiler alert, it's actually pretty easy to do. Then in part 3 I'm going to go batshit bananas, kicking it old school with emulators, everything from the Atari 2600 all the way up through to the PlayStation 1 and PSP and stuff. Till then, I am Blunty, thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.